Hello, this is Kovacs, and my topic for today is talking about the landscape and the different landscape positions impact on our crop production. Many of us like to gaze our eyes in a nice rolling landscape as we drive by, but we may not even think that deep into the potential challenges as we can see or as we can face on these rolling fields. So in the next few minutes, we will see some of those challenges and changes what we can anticipate in some of these rolling landscapes. Probably one of those observations what we can see, and you can see a plot average yield from my study from 2012 in Indiana, where we were comparing different nutrient placement methods, and we had two nitrogen rates. One was 130, the other one is 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And what we can see as the elevation increased or were higher, our yield dropped. And if you recall, 2012 was that extreme dry weather, and our elevation changes weren't too big. We had about 5 foot differences between the lowest to the highest point of this section of the field. But still, we can see close to 140 bushel yield differences in that extremely dry year. And if we are breaking down to a different nitrogen rates, so each plot uh, is the same nitrogen rate with different nutrient placement methods. But again, highlighting the raw data, we can see the individual points that as the elevation were higher in this field, our yield decreased, and this would be the other uh, nitrogen rate what we used for this study. But even I have a data from 2020 from Hungary for a wheat field, and here we had about 15-foot height differences, and still we can see in some of those higher elevations we had lower yield compared to a lower positions. And obviously, in a better yield or better year, we may see opposite observations. So if you look at this picture, this aerial imagery, and try to focus on this field, if we would have a live session, I would have asked you to what differences do you observe on this field? But I still will pause for a couple of seconds that you can take a look at this field and try to identify some of the differences, what we can see or what patterns you can recognize at this field. So hopefully the very first one what you have noted is the different colors. So we have some lighter tan colors versus a darker, some places even black color. And maybe one pattern what you can also recognize here is a small creek or ditch or sort of a water stream, what we can see. And all those dark areas are surrounding this stream. And it is not as well, we can see as well on this photo, but likely we can associate that these fields or this part of the field where we have these lighter colors, probably we even had some erosion occur in the past few decades or so. If you would take a soil sample or dug a hole and look at the soil profile, we could see the differences, especially the color differences, which would indicate some organic matter differences, having much higher organic matter content in the right hand of the picture. But also, if you were taking some soils courses, the color differences, especially here at the deeper part of the soil profile, would indicate to us that at the lower position, we would have some drainage issue as well. So we can see this grayish color showing the poorly drained soils. So we would qualify and classify some of these areas in this field. We would identify some poorly drained spots, mostly at the lower positions or lower landscape positions, while more likely we would see some well-drained spots at the higher positions of the field. And between those on the slopes, probably we would see somewhere either moderately well or somewhat poorly drained soils, depend on how close we are to the top of the hill or at the lowest part of those mini landscape positions. So if we try to look at what soil property changes could we anticipate as we moving along different landscape positions, we may think that soil depth could change, and probably what we would see a shallower soil depth at the top part of the landscape or at the top of the hill versus likely a deeper soil profile at the lower positions. Again, if we have some erosion, that soil depth differences would be even more obvious because from the erosion, likely we would have some soil movement away from the soil at the top of the hill, while at the depression positions, we may have some soil accumulation. We may also encounter some soil texture differences, especially if we have to consider wind erosion, that some of the lighter particles would move away from the, or finer particles would move away from the top of the hill. But as you recall the previous pictures, we would certainly anticipate differences in organic matter. As the lower positions, we would anticipate some water accumulation, and if we have more water, the organic matter degradation or decomposition would be slower. Thus, we would have a higher accumulation, and if we have a drier region, more likely those lower positions would be the better yielding areas, so likely we would have a higher biomass production in those areas as well, further enhancing some of those organic matter differences. Combination of these property differences and also that the fact that the water would flow towards the lower positions, likely we would have some differences in soil water retention too, because even if we receive some precipitation, some of the water will start to go downwards toward on the slope from the top of the hill, and obviously a better chance of water accumulation would occur at the depression positions, and most of those water would be available longer. And the next question, how these different organic matter content, water retention could influence soil nutrient levels and some of the soil movement or soil nutrient movements. Certainly, if we have organic matter differences, we could expect a different rate of mineralization and nutrient release from those areas of the field. And even if we think about the nutrient movement, especially with those nutrients moving by mass flow, that some of the nutrients could move along the landscape position. But even just the nutrient acquisition, as the plant will use some of the soil moisture to acquire the nutrients, could be influenced by these landscape positions. If we look at the plant side of it, what type of crop impact we can anticipate from the different landscape positions? Couple of the typical crop stress, what I would consider right away is water stress and nutrient stress. So if we have a drier or more of a dry spell during the growing season, most of the water stress or lack of water will first show up at the higher elevations, and with that, more likely the nutrient will be an issue for those plants as well. But at the other hand, if we have a wet weather or wet early spring, we would more likely to see some water accumulation and water or ponding water in the lower depressional area. So that could also introduce some of the crop stress and lead potential drowning some of the crops. And if we think about the nutrient side, especially for nitrogen, if we have some standing water in those lower positions, that could start to enhance some of the denitrification processes or some of the nutrient movement from those positions. We may even have to think some of the pest pressures, especially disease issues that at the lower depressional areas, if we have more moisture in those areas, whether the increased humidity or microclimate would be a more better environment for the disease to potentially develop within the field. The other important thing what we may have to think or we have to consider, what type of soil sample strategies are we using in these landscape or rolling fields, especially if you are using grid soil sampling. Would you adjust your grids to these higher or lower elevations, or potentially you would sample both or multiple landscape positions and mix your soil samples together, or try to separate the areas and make some separate samples from the higher landscape position compared to the lower landscape positions. Certainly it will depend on the extent of these positions and how uniform the field or how much elevation changes we can actually see within the field. Now using GPS, it can be easily detectable in terms of whether it's the high, elevation map or through elevation map as we can potentially create from some of our field operations, or even if we just want to more using the yield map, those lower yielding areas and try to identify them on the field. Or if we try to go with a somewhat separate management strategy during or on these areas, we can also utilize the GPS to potentially trigger some of the variable rate application or different management zones for those areas. So what type of management practices or farming considerations should we think about for the different landscape positions? First and foremost, we have to evaluate that how can we minimize plant stress on these extreme positions, whether at the top of the hill or at the depressional areas. At the higher elevation, again, depend on what would be the typical weather conditions that would this be the better yielding or the lower yielding areas. But if we anticipate more of a drier weather conditions, probably this would be the lower yielding areas. Are there hybrids or varieties out there which could withstand better these stressful conditions? Would changing seeding rate help in minimizing some of the stress? For example, in the case of corn, if we would lower the seeding rate and lower the plant population, that could potentially lower the plant stress, and maybe we could get same yield or better yield with a lower seeding rates. In the case of soybean, that's likely going other ways around, that we may need to increase the seeding rate that we could achieve the same amount of pods in these stressful environments. How would the nutrient requirements change? So one thing is that we have a lower yield. Would that mean that we would have to apply less amount of nutrients to achieve that yield? And that will likely be or can vary from field to field or from farm to farm. If you look at the depression areas, again, similar way, whether a hybrid or variety selection can help mitigate some of the plant stresses. Depend on whether we are expecting a drier yield or a wetter yield. Obviously, if we have a wetter yield, these depressional areas could be the really stressful, where we can see water accumulation and maybe even drowning some of the plants. Would seeding rate change some of the pictures? Again, going back to that disease treatment, if we have these depressional areas early spring, probably they will be a little bit more wet than at the higher elevation position at the higher elevation, and maybe soil temperatures will be colder. So would an extra seed treatment or an in-furrow fungicide application for these certain areas help to minimize the disease pressure? If we think about nutrient application, especially for nitrogen, can we potentially apply just the nitrogen stabilizers in these areas only? So these could be that strategies where we could potentially save some of the inputs, where we anticipate an extra pressure on the seeds or on the plants. And certainly today's planters are able or capable to potentially plant two different varieties or the same variety with some extra seed treatments. Again, with planters with electromotors can easily change our seeding rate, and some of our nutrient applicators, especially if it's a liquid, could inject those nitrogen stabilizers on the fly for our products. Let's see how the topography or the elevation is impacting some of our decisions, whether it's fertilizer rate or seeding rate. And in 2019, we conducted a survey among producers focusing on nutrient management, but we included some questions related to precision ag and variable rate applications. So on this graph, we broke out the different size of farms, and you can see the 4 different colors, and we will focus more on the larger areas than more than 1,000 acres. So those producers who producing on more than 1,000 acres. You can see the different categories what these producers are using to determine their fertilizer rate. And at the x-axis, we have the percent of the responders who using soil test, soil types, or the yield maps to determine their fertilizer rates, and you can see the total answers for each of the categories. So what we can see that topography or elevation map itself is not the most popular data layer, but perhaps because this is not necessarily the easiest data layer to capture compared to a soil type or a yield map in this case. But if we think about the yield map, as we saw previously at the first couple of slides when I started my presentation, that we can see that the yield map can actually reflect on some of those topography differences as well, and maybe even the soil test levels. So we can see that combining the yield maps depend on the producers. Somewhere between 30 to 45% of them are using for variable rate fertilizer application, but even the topography map alone, 15 to 25% of the large producers using this as a data layer. For the seeding rate, we have a similar pattern that 15 to 25 or close to 30% of the producers are using the topography map topography map or elevation map to determine their seeding rate, but still the yield map and the soil types are the important factors. And at both variable rate, both seeding rate and for the fertilizer rate, we can see that personal knowledge of the field is important. So that could also incorporate some of these elevation or landscape position differences. So with that, I would like to acknowledge some of our funding sources, both for my PhD studies, where we get that nice data set from the beginning of the presentation, and the South Dakota Nutrient Research and Education Council for providing funding for our survey. And at this point, I thank you for your attention, and I would welcome the questions on the live sessions once we resume in middle of February.